long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
Star Wars Endgame, a Darth Maul tale, by James Luceno, 2012. This short story takes place after Maul's lightsaber duel with Qui-Gon Jinn on Tatooine, as Maul takes command of the occupying Trade Federation army on Naboo. Created and read by the Archivist Publishing. As the shadow of the Trade Federation spreads over Naboo, a streak of darkness cuts through the Federation's heart. For Darth Sidious has sent his apprentice to oversee the annihilation of Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, plunging the galaxy into war and announcing the presence of the Sith to the Jedi. The balance between dark and light is on a precarious edge. And for Darth Maul, the beginning may actually be the end of a long game. The Sith infiltrator was in hyperspace when Darth Maul engaged the autopilot to give himself time to think. Reflection was so foreign to him that the impulse to look inward left him momentarily astonished, though not enough to keep him seated at the ship's controls. Shrugging out of the acceleration chair's harness, he rose and paced from the control console to the aft arc of passenger seats. Then from the entrance of the lift to the power cell array access panels. Though Tatooine was light years behind him, he couldn't shake the planet from his thoughts. And despite the scimitar's speed and cloaking ability, it was as if the sleek ship, too, were incapable of outracing the past.
If I had it to do over again, he thought.
In his thoughts, he was dropped into the speeder bike's open cockpit, racing across Tatooine's desolate landscape. In the next moment, executing an impromptu, though acrobatic leap that carried him to the yellow ground, his lightsaber in hand. Its energy blade meeting that of the Jedi Master, whose name he had since learned was Qui-Gon Jinn. Probe droids, which Maul had dispatched upon landing on Tatooine, had located the bearded human Jedi in the stands of the pod race stadium, and later in the settlement known as Mos Espa. One of the trio of Dark Eyes had also discovered the Queen of Naboo's starship, where it had put down in the wastes of the Zelric Draw. Intent on availing himself of every advantage, Maul had waited for Qui-Gon to set out on foot for the gleaming ship before launching his surprise attack. Qui-Gon and a human slave boy had hurried across the oven-like wastes while Maul watched from the padded comfort of the speeder's seat. Maul's eyes were better adapted than human eyes to the glare of Tatooine's twin suns. His lithe body better suited than the Jedi heavyweight's body to fighting in soft sand. And yet nothing had gone as planned. Somehow Qui-Gon heard the sibilant whine of the speeder's repulsor lift and had whirled aside at the last instant. With some 250 meters separating Qui-Gon and the slave boy from Queen Amidala's vessel, Maul would have had time to whip the speeder through a turn and make a second pass. Instead, in his eagerness to face off at last with a celebrated Jedi lightsaber master, he had leapt into action. Qui-Gon's shrewd readiness had almost taken Maul off his guard. But the first ferocious clash of their blades had told him that the Jedi was equally surprised. And why shouldn't he be? About being attacked. Not only by a Dathomiri Zabrak who had appeared out of nowhere, but also by one trained in the dark arts and wielding a crimson-bladed lightsaber. Regardless, Qui-Gon had quieted his mind and brought his imposing might to bear against Maul's agility. He had matched Maul's furious strokes with a disciplined intensity all his own. In the midst of their no-quarter contest, the Jedi had even managed to order the slave boy to flee for the safety of the waiting ship, where Maul had nearly forgotten all about him.
The Force favors this Jedi,
Maul recalled thinking, after all the droids, assassins, gangsters, and soldiers he had vanquished. Finally, a worthy opponent. Not since he had fought and been defeated by his own master, Darth Sidious, had Maul been so committed to a challenge. Then just when Qui-Gon's stamina was beginning to flag and the fight was tipping in Maul's favor, the incomprehensible had occurred. Qui-Gon had fled. Instead of standing fast and fighting to the finish, he had bounded onto the lowered boarding ramp of the Royal Starship as it was lifting off, leaving Maul sandblasted as much by disenchantment as raw anger, to watch the craft disappear into Tatooine's blue sky. Many a being had run from Maul, but never a worthy one. When on orders from his master, he had single-handedly butchered the trainers and trainees at the Orsis Combat Academy 5 years earlier, not a being had fled. Not the Mandalorian, Melch, nor his pair of lethal Rhodians, not Trezza or his well-trained Nautolan ward Kalindi. All had stood their ground and died with honor. Spinelessness was something that had never entered Maul's imaginings. What then was he now supposed to think of the Jedi whom he had been raised to hate since infancy? On Coruscant, before leaving for Tatooine, Maul had found it impossible to contain his enthusiasm. "At last, we reveal ourselves, Master," he had said to Sidious, and in the end that long-awaited moment of revelation had led to nothing more than disappointment. Watching the departing starship, Maul had wondered, could he succeed in tracking the Jedi and the Queen a second time? How would his failure impact the overall mission? At the time, he had tried to make excuses for himself, blaming his inability to overpower Qui-Gon on the leg wound he had sustained during his brief capture by Togorian pirates. Or the slave boy might have been to blame. A seeming nexus of Force energy. The boy had somehow abetted Qui-Gon in the fight, but Maul had known better than to make excuses to his master, or even mention the run-in with the Togorians. But if he had it to do over again, he wouldn't make it a challenge. Even if that meant depriving himself of the thrill of combat and the pleasure of seeing the pained surprise in Qui-Gon's eyes when Maul's blade pierced him. He would simply race in at top speed with his lightsaber already ignited and decapitate Qui-Gon Jinn where he stood. That way he might also have been able to pilot the speeder through the ship's open hatch, kill Qui-Gon's Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and capture the Queen. How his master would have praised him then. Instead, Maul had been forced to weather Sidious's obvious disenchantment in abject humiliation. Darth Sidious had dismissed the setback, almost as if attributing Maul's failure to what? Surely not fate, since his master was as much as overseeing that. That left only Maul's lack of ability, his weakness. Currently, the two Jedi, the Queen, and her entourage of handmaidens and protectors were on Coruscant, and Maul had been ordered to Naboo to assist the loathsome Neimoidians in rooting out possible pockets of resistance, whilst Sidious modified the plan. Even Sidious despised having to deal with the Neimoidians, so the assignment to advise them felt like a punishment, as had happened following Maul's massacre of the leaders of the Black Sun crime syndicate. Then Maul had been banished from Coruscant after confessing to Sidious that he had identified himself as a Sith Lord to one of the crime bosses before killing him. In previous missions undertaken for his master, Maul had felt allied to the dark side, but something had changed since Tatooine. Was he now, in some sense, engaging the Force itself through its proxies, the Jedi? Should he have been more circumspect and lured the Jedi to him instead of initiating the attack? Would his master even allow him a second chance? He wouldn't have believed that his hatred for the Jedi could deepen, but it had, for making him appear ineffectual in the eyes of Darth Sidious and for putting him in such an untenable fix.
Enough thinking,
Maul commanded himself. The solution was that he couldn't allow himself to fail again. Convinced that he had put the past to rest, Maul came to a halt in the infiltrator's cabin. However, as if his legs had a will of their own, he was suddenly back in motion, pacing from the control console to the acceleration chairs.
If I had it to do over again,
he thought once more. Hollow images of Naboo didn't do it justice. A blue-green gem in an otherwise lackluster star system, the planet was one of the most pristine Maul had ever seen. This was as it should be, being the home world of Darth Sidious in his guise as Senator, perhaps soon to be Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. Years earlier, Maul had fallen prey to a plot that would have returned him to the world of his birth, Dathomir, but he had foiled the designs of his Night Sister abductors and pledged never to give thought to the life he might have led had he not been raised and trained by Sidious. As far as he was concerned, his home world was volcanic Mustafar, where he had fittingly been forged in fire. Integral to his master's plan, the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo had been in the works for several years. The plan had required positioning Viceroy Newt Gunray as director of the shipping cartel and manipulating the Republic Senate into allowing the Neimoidians to defend the enormous ships of their fleet with combat automata and other war machines. But the Senate had yet to learn the lengths to which the Trade Federation had gone to arm itself. The blockade had been in effect for some time, when Sidious had ordered the Neimoidians to invade and occupy the planet in response to the Jedi Order's attempt to intervene in the dispute. Attempts had been made on the lives of Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. But the Neimoidians had proved no match for the Jedi, and so the forceful duo had managed to spirit Queen Amidala safely off Naboo. The blockade had initially numbered hundreds of vessels, but Maul realized on arriving at Naboo that the Neimoidians, ever fretful about diminished profits, had since returned almost all of their ships to the business of intergalactic transport. Well, they were nothing more than merchants, he reminded himself. But their greediness offended him almost as much as Qui-Gon's cowardice. At Tatooine, it hadn't been necessary to employ the scimitar's cloaking capabilities, but Maul did so now in order to maneuver the ship into the core of what remained of the Trade Federation armada, which consisted of half a dozen freighters and a single ring-shaped Lucra Hulk-class control ship, which oversaw all elements of the Neimoidians' droid army. Though formidable, the control ship was not impregnable, and the shoddiness of the operation sickened him. A stealth team made up of agents of the sort Treza had trained on Orsis would have been able to infiltrate the vessel easily and destroy it from within, essentially paralyzing the Trade Federation's entire force. Maul was certain he could penetrate the ship on his own, and was sorely tempted to do so, if only to rub Gunray's muzzled face in the flaws of his strategy. But he contented himself with piloting the infiltrator to well within firing range of the control ship and a squadron of drone starfighters, without the Neimoidians even being aware of his presence. Maul took the scimitar through a low and slow orbit around Naboo, studying aerial close-ups of the northern continent's grassy flatlands, lush hills, and extensive swamps and lakes. The galaxy boasted many such scenic wonders, but what made Naboo unique, and had in some sense doomed it, was the planet's plasma core, and the maze of underground tunnels and caverns the seething magma had fashioned. Those corridors, however, were not visible from above, save for various entry points to underground oceans that were allegedly rife with behemoth aquatic creatures, and home to an indigenous species of amphibian humanoids who resided in bubble cities maintained by plasma technology. Once Darth Sidious had issued the command to invade Naboo, the assault and subsequent occupation had happened quickly, in part because of Queen Amidala's unwillingness to fight back. Not, in any case, that Naboo's small space force would have stood a chance against the Trade Federation army. Amidala may have been convinced that the Neimoidians were bluffing, which they certainly would have been without the goading of a Sith Lord. But even when the first landing ships had begun to disgorge anti-grav tanks and thousands of infantry droids, the young queen had ordered the Naboo Royal Security Forces to stand down and surrender. Only Viceroy Gunray's concern for the Trade Federation's galactic reputation had kept the invasion from turning into a slaughter, and only a fluke had allowed Amidala's starship to breach the blockade. Maul flew the invisible ship over several sprawling makeshift detention centers, where the entire populations of some of Naboo's compact cities were now imprisoned and forced to answer to battle droids. Employing coordinates furnished by Darth Sidious, he set the scimitar down outside the principal city of Theed, in a private hangar Sidious had assured him was secure. Maul used his wrist link to program his trio of probe droids to monitor the hangar. Then extracted the horseshoe-shaped speeder bike from its proprietary enclosure in the underside of the forward portside cargo hatch. Clothed in black robes and a hooded field cloak, he straddled the speeder and aimed it for Theed. The deserted city of stately domes and elegant spires struck him as an artifact, or perhaps a quaint historical replica closed for routine maintenance. Squads of B-1 battle droids armed with blaster rifles patrolled the narrow streets and stood sentry outside the Theed Palace and other major buildings, evading them effortlessly. Maul timed the patrols, made note of their numbers, and used the Force to create sounds that tricked the droids into moving in one direction or another. The idea of using droids as combatants annoyed him, for droids were only as good as their programming, and the bipedal, slender-headed B-1 had limited skills and no ability to perform autonomously. Only the fact that the droids, too, were integral to his master's more far-reaching plan kept Maul from revulsion. The deeper he ventured into the galaxy, the less honor he found. But the Sith would redress that deficit once the Jedi were exterminated and the Republic brought down. Maul stowed the speeder in an alley that ran alongside Theed's Space Force hangar, which was perched on the edge of an escarpment. Inside the dome building, he took stock of Naboo's smart yellow and chromium Nubian fighters, neatly arranged in berths on several tiers, with an R2 astromech droid assigned to each ship. Despite the success of the occupation, the Neimoidians would have been wise to disable the fighters, but they were apparently incapable of tampering with anything of value, as with the control ship. Maul was tempted to show them the error of their ways, but again, he did nothing. Emerging from the hangar, he allowed himself to be detected and confronted by a patrol of droids. In a metallic voice, their officer unit ordered him to halt and raised its E5 rifle.
Halt! Prepare to be eliminated!
Certainly, his fascination with technology owed in part to the circumstances of his abnormal upbringing, but he had no compunction about destroying droids when the need arose, whether in training sessions or on missions. Still, he derived no enduring satisfaction from the contests, even when combating the most sophisticated among them, calling his long lightsaber to his hand. He made short work of the squad, decapitating them with his blade, or exploding them by deflecting blaster bolts back at them. The brief altercation drew several more patrols.
Look over there! Let's get him! Open fire! Roger, 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 roger!
The members of which he similarly dismembered. Then he went on the hunt for a red emblazoned security unit, and when he found one, he clamped his gloved hands around the thing's canted neck.
Ow!
And ordered it to establish contact with Viceroy Gunray.
Does not compute.
When the droid became unresponsive, he snapped its head off. And used it as he might a comlink, demanding that the Neimoidian technician with whom he eventually spoke relay the communication directly to Gunray. After a long moment, a patronizing voice issued from the battle droid's vocoder.
Lord Maul,
Gunray said.
We were not aware that you had arrived.
Of course you weren't.
Maul growled.
How may we be of service?
Maul squeezed the head so tightly, it began to fold in on itself.
You can begin by making certain that every droid on Naboo responds to me as its chief commander, Viceroy, or I will reduce this fine army of yours to a mountain of scrap.
Maul paced the polished stone floor of the Theed Palace throne room in brooding silence, his lightsaber affixed to the black leather cummerbund that cinched his robes. Draped in shimmer silk, Newt Gunray and his green-skinned diplomatic attaché, Rune Hako, stood alongside each other before a tall, arch-topped window, wringing their thick-fingered hands. A silver protocol droid attended them, and a mechno chair awaited the Viceroy's pleasure.
Several members of the Queen's security forces managed to elude our battle droids.
Gunray was saying in wheedling basic.
They rescued a group of Naboo captives and caused us some concern on an orbital station and at one of our plasma transshipment sites on the surface. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, the Naboo fell in with a visiting Hutt who happens to be in our employ. He betrayed their plans and location.
They are dead or imprisoned then?
Maul stopped to ask.
The captain is dead. Some of the others are still at large.
Maul resumed his angry pacing. He was familiar with both Neimoidians from holotransmissions conducted between them and Darth Sidious during the past year. They had dealt with Sidious from across cold space. But now, confronted with a flesh and blood Sith Lord, it was all they could do to keep from trembling in awe. A musky, low-tide odor wafted from Hako, who affected purple robes and a horned bonnet.
And the Gungans?
Maul said. The pair traded baffled looks.
What of them, Lord Maul?
Hako asked.
You've located their underwater cities and taken the necessary steps.
We're in the process,
Gunray said. A three-tine tiara crowned his mottled blue face.
How many have you captured?
The nictitating membrane of Gunray's red eyes spasmed.
How many?
Hundreds? Thousands?
The Viceroy improvised.
On the order of hundreds, I should think.
Maul was revolted by the fact that he was in some measure responsible for Gunray's lofty position, having executed missions that had elevated Gunray from a mere functionary to a being of galactic import. But Darth Sidious maintained that the Neimoidians were necessary to the Sith's grand plan. And part of that plan called for Naboo to be secured in preparation for the planet being annexed by the shipping cartel. With Queen Amidala on Coruscant, Naboo's surrender was not yet official, but Maul was certain that his master would find a way to bring it about.
Where are the Gungan captives?
Maul said. Again, the Neimoidians glanced at each other. They knew that Maul had already killed their treacherous confederate, Hathmonchar, and grasped that he would kill again if provoked. Gunray spoke first.
The corpses were dumped into the sea.
Atomized.
Hako said at the same time. Maul showed each of them a withering glance.
Which is it, dumped or atomized?
Atomized, then dumped into the sea.
Gunray said, proud of himself. Maul continued to glower at him.
You discarded atomized bodies.
The air went out of Gunray for a moment. Then he said,
The Gungans need not concern us.
Maul folded his arms across his chest and bared his filed teeth.
Why is that, Viceroy?
The amphibians would not risk engaging our overwhelming force.
Maul snorted.
The Gungans have a standing army 1,000 strong and strategic plasma weaponry.
Gunray looked at Hako, who said,
We didn't know.
Now you do.
Maul watched the slimy duo shake in their robes. These were invaders. These were the leaders of an army so easily cowed, so easily deceived, and covetous to the point that they had allowed themselves to be manipulated into instigating a war for a chance at increased profits. To them, wealth was an end unto itself. They had no understanding of real power, and seemingly no contact with the Force. They had more in common with the battle droids that served them than they had with sentient beings. How Trezza would have laughed. Sometimes Maul lamented having had to kill the Faline. But Trezza had learned too much about Maul's powers.
Who is supervising the search for the Gungan cities?
He said at last.
Commander OOM-9.
Gunray said.
A droid,
Maul said.
The predecessor of your inept B1s.
A superior droid, Lord Maul.
Hako was quick to point out.
Viceroy Gunray's personal guard.
Maul ignored him and spoke to Gunray.
Inform OOM-9 that I am assuming command of the search.
Maul demanded the most from the speeder bike as he left the plains and the Gallo Mountains behind and raced down through dense forest and into the swamplands to the south. Before leaving Theed, he had communicated with Darth Sidious. He had reason to believe that the mistakes he'd made on Tatooine had been forgiven, and that his mission was back on track. With the Republic Senate in turmoil, Sidious was confident that he would be able to persuade Queen Amidala to return to Naboo, and he suspected that Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi would accompany her. But Maul's excitement at the prospect of having a second go at them was dimmed by having to deal with the Gungans. business that had been entrusted to the Nemoidians. Surely Sidious knew that Gunray was incapable of doing what had been asked of him. And yet Sidious had kept vital information from the Viceroy that would have enabled him to locate the underwater cities of the Indigenes. Why, then, had Sidious provided the information to Maul now? Was this yet another in the series of tests his master had put him through over the past 5 years to substantiate his loyalty and skill? The question rode with him into the forward observation base OOM-9 had established on the shore of an insect-plagued marsh. The forest was tall here, and the slender trees seemed to grow from the fetid water itself. In a clearing, a full company of battle droids waited in precise ranks, augmented by a dozen droidicas. Other droids were scouting the marsh on single-trooper aerial platforms. Close to the shore hovered a clamshell-shaped aquatic destroyer equipped with arrays of short-range lasers and tank-like siege engines. Maul was impressed. The scene at least had the appearance of a legitimate military exercise. OOM-9 approached as he was dismounting the speeder bike.
"Welcome, Commander,"
it said in a forthright way, its chest plastron emblazoned with yellow markings. OOM-9 boasted multiple antennae and a backpack that boosted its operational range. Maul knew that the droid had been tasked with spearheading the occupation and was credited with having raised Naboo communication centers at New Centrif and Vis, as well as having secured the cities of Heart Secure, Spinnaker, and Theed. From a captured mariner in Heart Secure, OOM-9 had learned of a Gungan bubble city called Relius, but its forces had thus far been unable to locate the city.
Viceroy Gunray said that you have already captured many Gungans,
Maul said.
Exactly how many?
The droid's processor hummed faintly as it communicated with computers aboard the orbiting control ship.
"How many did the Viceroy say we captured?"
It asked in a grating monotone.
47.
Maul told it.
"Yes, Commander, we captured 47.
Maul frowned in exasperation, but forgave OOM-9 the lie.
Show me to them.
The droid pivoted through a half-circle and turned its thin head back toward Maul.
"This way, Commander."
A short, winding trail through the trees led to a place where 4 Gungans were laid out on the ground, their cartilaginous bodies holed by blaster bolts. With their billed faces, floppy ears, stalked eyes, and lolling tongues, they certainly didn't look capable of waging war, but Sidious had warned Maul not to underestimate the species.
"These Gungans were apprehended while exchanging goods with Naboo traders outside the city of Monia."
OOM-9 explained.
Where are the Naboo traders?
"Confined in Detention Camp 6, Commander."
Maul took a moment to observe a STAP patrol buzzing overhead.
You found no signs of Relius?
"None, Commander. It is possible that the Gungans have devices capable of foiling our penetrating scanners."
Maul considered it. However slight, there was a chance the Gungans were capable of doing something that could jeopardize his task of killing the Jedi and capturing the Queen, and he could not have that.
This is not the time for subtlety,
he told OOM-9.
Poison the waters. If that does not bring the Gungans to the surface, then drain the marsh.
Took the speeder bike out of the lowlands, following a twisting path that climbed back into the lush foothills of the Gallo Range. Farms began to appear with stately old houses set far back from the roadbed. Reasoning that revolt of any sort would likely begin in one of the cities, the Neimoidians had not sent their droids into the area. But clearly the Naboo farmers were aware of what had happened elsewhere, as many of the houses were abandoned An agricultural machine sat silently in the midst of furrowed fields. Eventually, Maul located the place Sidious had told him to seek out, posted where the roadbed intersected the lane that accessed the house. A sign written in Basic and Futhork read, "Summit Farm Blossom Winery." Maul waited at the sign. East and west of the lane, as far as he could see, spread field after field of cultivated plants, their vibrant flowers varying in color, size, and shape. The warm air was redolent with their heady fragrances. Maul swung the speeder bike over the lane and moved slowly toward the house. In some of the fields, Naboo men working alongside labor droids stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. One man set off in a run for the house, clearly to announce Maul's arrival. The house was a well-cared-for building made of wood and stone, with a quaint peaked roof. Some distance from the house, 2 ancient windmills spun. In an outbuilding larger than the house, Maul could see extraction presses and wooden storage barrels. He had just brought the speeder to a halt when a short Naboo woman exited through the house's front door, wiping her hands on a work apron and appraising him openly. As sturdily built as her house, the woman had sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and close-cropped silver hair. The muscular worker who had tipped her off lingered behind, his posture indicating that he had a blaster tucked into the waistband of his pants at the small of his back. Maul brought his left leg over the speeder's U-shaped saddle and stood for a moment, allowing the woman to study him while he peeled off his long black gloves and draped them over the steering bar.
"You have ridden a long way,"
she said.
"You must be thirsty. Come inside."
She turned and walked back into the house. Her protector stepped away, allowing Maul to pass before following him inside. The interior was cool and dim and decorated with wooden furniture and other old things. The woman returned from a food preparation area and handed Maul a clear drink, cooled by crushed ice. He took a small sip, testing it for poison, then drank the sweet liquid down in one long pull while the woman traded furtive glances with her bodyguard. With a nod of her pointed chin, she signaled the man to leave the room, but he didn't go far. When Maul handed her the empty glass, she gestured to a couch.
"Sit down, won't you? And tell me what I can do for you."
Maul didn't move.
I need location coordinates for the principal Gungan cities.
She blinked in surprise.
"Who told you I have information of that sort?"
Do you or don't you?
She narrowed her eyes in understanding and showed him a fleeting, tight-lipped smile.
"I knew the Neimoidians couldn't have pulled off something like this on their own. How long have you been working with the Trade Federation?"
Maul glowered.
The Gungan cities.
"I'm afraid you've come all this way for nothing."
Seeing the fire in Maul's yellow eyes, she quickly added,
"Now, hold on a moment. Just because I don't know the coordinates doesn't mean I don't know someone who does."
Who?
Maul snapped. She sat down on the couch.
"First things first. Just how much do you know about me or think you know?"
Maul stood over her.
Your name is Magneta. You were Chief of Security for the former king.
She forced a short exhale.
"I'd ask your name, but I'm sure it wouldn't mean anything to me."
Maul went on.
Before the election of Queen Amidala, the king was planning to tap additional plasma reservoirs in the Gungan areas. He contracted with an off-world mining company to do the surveys, and was prepared to go to war with the Gungans if they resisted. He abdicated the throne before, putting the plan into action.
"Abdicated."
Magneta said, drawing out the word.
A curious way to put it. Do you know how King Varuna died?
Maul fought to control his impatience.
I do not know, and I do not care.
She studied his face.
Odd. When you rode up, I immediately figured you for the assassin we could never locate.
Maul snorted.
You figured wrong. Who knows the location of the underwater cities?
Magneto sighed.
All right, have it your way. You'll want to talk to a Bothan named Laker. He's chief surveyor for the company King Varuna hired, but I'm not sure where he can be found. I've tried to keep an ear to the ground, but from here there's only so much I'm able to learn. Laker was preparing to leave Naboo when the Nemoidians sprang their surprise blockade. He tried to reason with them, but as with many other off-worlders, he wasn't permitted to leave. No ships in or out, no exceptions. He was in Moenia when the invasion occurred, and no doubt he was caught up in it. So, the first place I'd look would be in the closest detention camps.
Maul turned and headed for the door. He was about to go through it when Magneto said,
Be sure to give my regards to the moon.
Maul stopped and swung slowly around.
What moon?
Higo Damask.
He shook his head.
I do not know the name.
Magneto tipped her head to one side in suspicion.
I find that very unlikely, since I'm certain that Higo Damask and his puppet, Naboo's illustrious Senator Palpatine, have their arms to the elbows in this invasion and occupation.
Maul betrayed no surprise even at the mention of his master's alias.
Who is Higo Damask?
Who is...
Magneto ran her eyes over his mask of a face.
You actually don't know. I.e. Damask is a mobster masquerading as a banker. It was Damask who brokered the original deal to have Naboo's plasma mined and shipped by the Trade Federation. I suspect he's also the one behind Palpatine's campaign for the Chancellorship. They've been in collusion for over 2 decades.
Maul was secretly stunned. He knew the names of some of Palpatine's cohorts, Sate Pistage, Kinman Doriana, and others, but the name Higo Damask was new to him, as was Magneto's assertion that the moon was in some way controlling Palpatine. Was it possible that Darth Sidious himself had a clandestine master? The idea was too far-fetched to contemplate, let alone accept.
Ah, so I have touched on something.
Magneto said, watching him closely.
Then you might as well know the rest. There's good reason to believe that Damask and Palpatine were the ones responsible for King Varuna's death. They needed to install pretty little Amidala on the throne so they could take full control of the planet, while making it seem as if the Trade Federation were responsible.
She paused, then added,
Palpatine double-crossed me, even after I allowed his agent Pestage to get away with the murder of more than a dozen pro-Gungan Naboo.
She gestured broadly.
And instead of being taken into the fold, I end up here, in humiliated self-exile for failing to save Varuna's life.
Maul knew something about humiliation, but Magneto had gone too far in airing her grievances, however justified. Palpatine could not be suspected of being tied to the Neimoidians or to the invasion of Naboo. Maul heard Magneto's bodyguard move, and Magneto too, going for a holdout blaster concealed beneath her apron. Maul was also aware that several field workers were gathered just outside the door, waiting to spring an ambush. Snarling, he whirled, moving faster than human eyes could follow, breaking Magneto's neck with the edge of his hand. Then spinning again to send his stiffened right foot into the chest of the bodyguard as he rushed into the room. A hail of blaster bolts came through the front door. Dodging them, Maul ran across the room and dived head first through a window, somersaulting in midair so that he hit the ground on his feet, now centered among his astonished opponents. Growling, he clenched his bare hands and set on them, killing one after another.